everybody. I don't think I need this mic, but anyway, happen to have it in my hand. I'm Celeste Fraser. This is the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition. And you all know about this organization, when it started, and I see nods and shakes. It started as right after the 2013 flood. So we spent between $4 and $5 million in grants trying to get the watershed back to its present self. And that meant replanting the riparian areas, cleaning out all the debris. And so today we're in the business of keeping our forest healthy. And apparently I've been reading about, if you're gonna have a watershed, a healthy watershed, you have to have a healthy forest. That's a must, or I guess land if you're in the middle of Illinois. So we've been working with, Willen is tied into, hi Willen, raise your hand. Willen's tied into the fire shed, so we communicate with everybody who takes care of our forests. And that's really taking up our time right now. So today we're going to talk about ptarmigans. It's going to be white-tailed ptarmigans. They're the only bird that lives above the tree line. So that's tundra and the Arctic. So we're in for a treat today. I should tell you our next talk is going to be August 7th, and it's about beavers. But the cool thing is, the beavers will have a talk on the 28th of August, and that's a field trip down to Chile Camp. And you're gonna see the Fish Creek was really hurt during the 2013 flood, and we have taken upon ourselves to restore all that. Now, it's come back to life. We've created beaver dam analogs. The beavers moved in and fixed everything we forgot to do. So it was really cool. So come to the meeting, the talk, and the field trip. Okay, we'll see you soon. This is Meg Mahoney. This is Meg Mahoney, everybody.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I have the privilege today of talking about these stinking cuties, in my opinion, the white-tailed ptarmigan. So first, a little bit about me. My name's Meg. I have my educational background. I got my bachelor's in fish, wildlife, and conservation biology from CSU. Then I popped up to Canada for a few years and got my master's in biological sciences, where I studied the much less cute invasive sea lamprey in the Great Lakes, if you're familiar. They're long, eel, snake-like parasites, so it was definitely a nice change to come back to Colorado, head up into the mountains, and now I study white-tailed ptarmigan. My research focus, I'm primarily a genetics researcher, so I do studying local adaptation of these guys, their mating systems, stuff we're all going to talk about today. I'm interested in vertebrate ecology, landscape genetics, like I said, and local adaptation, and then climate change and rain shifts. And then I also am really passionate about scientific communication and yeah, so love being able to talk to the community. And I think for today's talk, if you have a question, let's just raise your hand during the talk, and I'm happy to chat about whatever is interesting to folks, and yeah, we'll just do it that way, so don't be shy. And then, of course, I have to thank my collaborators, a whole bunch of folks that make my research possible, both at the US Geological Survey, which my work is funded through, and then at CSU. Oh, and then I have to mention, because last summer, we had a photographer come out and take some absolutely stunning photos of birds. This is some of his work, Peter Baker, so I have to shout him out too, because it was super magical. Okay, so what is a ptarmigan? Let's start there. So if we're going as broad as possible, they belong to the family Galliformes, which are your heavy-bodied, ground-dwelling birds. They can fly, just not a whole lot. So think your chickens, turkeys, that's a grouse there in the top middle, quails, those kind of game birds that you think of, usually super tasty with that dark meat in their legs, because they're walking along the ground and have that good muscle. So then we move on to the genus Lagopus. There are three birds in this genus. There is the rock ptarmigan, the white-tailed in the middle, and then the willow ptarmigan. And white-tailed ptarmigan is the only ptarmigan species that is only found in North America. The other two are also found in Eurasia. So the white-tailed ptarmigan is also the farthest south of all three of the bird species. So you're only going to find your rock and willow ptarmigan up in like Alaska area and parts of Canada, versus we're very lucky to have the white-tailed ptarmigan here in Colorado due to our large swaths of alpine. And where these guys all co-occur, so parts of Alaska, you do have all three of the species of ptarmigan all occupying the same territory. However, you usually find your willow ptarmigan around tree line, your rock ptarmigan a little higher, and then your white-tailed ptarmigan at the tippy top of mountains. So they do tend to segregate by species that way. But during the last time the glaciers, it's called the post-Pleistocene glacial retreat, when the glaciers came down from up north and then retreated, it actually deposited ptarmigan here in Colorado, and then you don't see them until way farther up north. So that's why there's that gap there, just because they became evolutionarily distinct. They're still the same species, but we see a lot of genetic differentiation between our south and northern more white-tailed ptarmigan. So what does Lagopus mean? It comes from ancient Greek, lagos meaning hair and pus meaning foot. And you can see from these pictures here, in the winter they get really furry, well they're feathers, but they look very furry, almost snowshoe-like feet, and they can just run along the top of the snow. They sink sometimes, which is pretty cute, but yeah, they're really quick and agile over the top of the snow because of those specially adapted feet. And then Leucura comes from ancient Greek also, leucos meaning white and aura meaning tail. So there on y'all's right, you can see that is a rock and a willow ptarmigan. They have distinctive black tail feathers. So the white-tailed ptarmigan, as the name suggests, if you ever see a ptarmigan that has a white tail, then you can, rest assured it's a white-tailed ptarmigan. Okay, so this is what their distribution looks like here in Colorado. They're pretty widespread just because we have so much alpine habitat. So above that tree line, like Celeste mentioned, and they do span out pretty far west as well. And then we actually have even some, they're not doing great, but there are some ptarmigan that are in New Mexico. They've been transplanted out there to try to get an active population. They're not doing so great, but they are doing great here, which we'll talk about. So they are in New Mexico too, just a fun fact. Okay, so now drill history. What is life like up in the Alpine? And I can tell you from personal experience, having spent a lot of hours up there, we have really severe temperature fluctuations. It can fluctuate by up to 70 degrees in a day, really hot during the day, freezing cold when the sun goes down at night, very windy, there's not a lot of windbreaks. And is anybody familiar with the term crumbles? Yeah, so it's a special form of vegetative growth that it's so windy up there that the trees and shrubs grow almost sideways and really twisted. Ptarmigan love that for cover, but it's not a great windbreak. If you've ever hiked in the Alpine, you know it's very stormy. Storms come on just kind of out of nowhere. And all of this kind of leads to a very short growing season. Just a couple months of the year, we see green up there. Hypoxic conditions, so hard to breathe, which you all in Estes probably have a little bit more of an advantage than us down in Fort Collins and lower, but even more so up there. And then lastly, as I can tell you, the UV radiation is pretty brutal up there. So these are all things that animals and plants that live up in the Alpine have to evolve and adapt in order to thrive. So those are covered up, but I'll speak to that really quick. Sorry about that. So a lot of times in the Alpine, or in just high altitude populations, we see this kind of bluish coloration in feathers particularly, because it's really good at both helping with UV radiation and heat retention as well. So you see unique pigmentation and adaptations, which ptarmigan have different adaptations, but I always like to throw that in there because you just see this high concentration of blue coloration in birds that live altitude, so kind of a fun fact. Okay, so what else is shaping these guys? So predation, things like coyotes, foxes, weasels, birds of prey, pretty much anything that can catch them will eat them. Like I said, they make a tasty meal, hunters will eat them as well. And we have a lot of nest predation as well, so like the marmots, lots of rodents will find nests as a tasty treat. Available forage, so like I said, the growing season is very short, so finding, particularly in the winter, plants that come up through the snow cover and then they eat what they can. We'll talk about that. Available moisture, which is very important. Obviously they have to drink water, and then that also leads to thermoregulation. So that leads into precipitation. These pictures are all taken like a month apart, May, June, July. So you can see how quickly things change up there. These were all taken at Mount Blue Sky, formerly Mount Evans, if you all are familiar, down in Idaho Springs. So that really speaks to how quickly these birds go through such a rapid environmental change and are able to adapt in not even just seasonally, but over time as well. So how do they keep warm? Like I mentioned, they have that really large body size. Their surface area to volume ratio is very high, and that allows them, they have really excellent heat retention because of their body shape. They absorb UV radiation very well. Again, they are adapted over a long period of time to live in that cold alpine where they really hold on to heat. And then their feathers are very plumaceous, so just the microstructure of their feathers really locks in warm air against their body and keeps them warm. And this actually curtails into they're excellent in the winter, but as our ecosystems are getting warmer, they're actually at very high risk of heat stress, even in, as what we would consider low temperatures of like 70 degrees. They're just so good at holding on to heat that they oftentimes struggle when it's too hot. So these pictures are so cute. Another adaptation they have in the winter is they roost in the snow. So a lot of times they'll just get in a big puddle of ptarmigan underneath the snow to keep warm, and they just really use deep snowpack as a way to insulate themselves. Okay, forage, like I mentioned, they're constantly eating. They're pretty opportunistic. You can see this guy's munching on a biscuit right here. They'll just eat any flowering up that they can find, and it changes throughout the year, like I mentioned. Usually willow, so Salix family, or genus rather, is the only plant that will be able to come up through the snowpack, and you'll have little willow buds, and they nibble on that, or when they're burrowed in the snow, they'll find willow to forage on. And the rest of the summer, spring, when it's, those few months that it's green, yeah, they're very opportunistic. And then there are also a lot of invertebrates that they consume, particularly the chicks will go after. Grasshoppers, you'll see them you scatter the grasshoppers and the chicks will go run after them. Because it's a good source of protein and they grow very quickly. So crypsis is another adaptation. Can anyone tell me how many ptarmigan you think are in this photo? And we'll give you a moment. And you'll tell me. You're in 4 or 5? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, there's actually a 7 up here. You can barely see it. Okay, sorry, that's cheating on my behalf. But yeah, so one of the most, I think, iconic things about white-tailed ptarmigan and other ptarmigan is that they go through a seasonal molt, so they are all white in the summer, and you all saw some pictures of that, or winter rather, and then they go through this, it's called a nuptial molt because it's ready when they're ready to mate. They get this brown coloration, and it's amazing how well they mimic the lichen and other, coloration on rocks. I've seen like 1,000+ ptarmigan at this point, and I still walk right into them. They're just right underfoot. It's quite amazing. So yeah, like I said, in winter, this was in probably October, so still holding on to just a few of those nuptial feathers. But they start to move down to lower elevations, a little bit more protected from those, wind, snowstorms. They're in drainages, basins, and meadows, and like I said, they feed on that willow that comes up through the snowpack. Then in spring, they like to hang out closer to tree line, and they really like shrubby areas and edges of snow patches where there is, think of that snow melting at the edges, and it's causing vegetation to be to green up around those edges. And then additionally, they have these, like I said, that's kind of mid-molt, so they hang out on snow where it's white next to the rocks, and they really do just look like a snow-speckled rock. Like I said, they like to hang out around crumbles because it's a good windbreak, protection from predators, and then, you know, good indicator of there's vegetation around. And then in the summer, June to October, they're moving up from tree line all the way up as the tundra is warming and greening, selecting for boulders, shrubs, and edges of snow patches. They really like to hunt out shade. Like I said, they really sometimes struggle to keep cool, and they like water a lot as well, so they'll just hang out by the little streams that form up there due to snow melt, feeding on plants and insects, and like I said, they're going through that really pretty brown nuptial molt. However, this was a bird from last year. We found these birds, these were both in August. So this lady just never ended up going through her molt, and we've seen her 3 years in a row now, all white in the middle of the summer. So sometimes there are, you know, it's regulated by hormones, we think. Well, we know that it is, but we think she probably just has some kind of hormone regulation, and yeah, it was just, I don't know, interesting anecdote that, you know, things don't always go perfectly, and sometimes you see a white ptarmigan in a flock of 30 other brown birds, so. Okay, so I'm going to go much deeper into this because this is what my PhD dissertation is focusing on. But just a brief overview for now. White-tailed ptarmigan are generally monogamous. So around late May, June, we see them pair up pretty strictly. So we'll have, and I'll talk about this too, but you can see we band the birds. You see the little colored, cute little bangles on their legs. So we can really easily tell which bird is which, and they are quite faithful. Put a pin in that. So we see the same birds paired up until the hen lays eggs in June, early July. And then the male will go join a flock of other males usually. Again, we'll get more into that in a minute. The males are very highly territorial. They will pretty aggressively mate guard, so if another male, they hear or see another one flying in, they will take off and chase the other one around away from their territory. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. Okay, nesting. They are on nest for a few weeks. It really varies based on the individual's hen preference. We don't really understand why, but sometimes we have hens that are really nicely hidden in willow, and then sometimes they're like this middle lady out in the middle of an open field next to a rock, making maybe questionable decisions, but anyway. Clutch sizes are usually between 6 to 8 chicks. Unfortunately, they have a pretty low chick survival rate, so if you get everyone to hatch, hoping to have maybe 2 or 3 chicks by, you know, make it to adulthood. Sometimes more, sometimes less. But fortunately, their mechanism is that they tend to have high adult survival. It's just hoping that the chicks make it to adulthood before that point. Because like I said, they're so small when they hatch and a nice walking snack for any predator that happens to see them. Oh yeah, so here's some chick pictures. They're super cute. Little puffballs, very chicken-like when they're first hatched. Okay, getting into threats. I addressed their most acute threats, but I of course have to talk about global declines of birds because it's a well-documented phenomenon. And if you look, we are in this gray Arctic tundra. So our tundra-dwelling birds are experiencing global declines. Yep, there you go. Fortunately, if you look at, these are, so it's a little bit dated at this point, about 10 years old, but these are just population trends, and you can see there's high variability, but overall pretty stable at Mount Blue Sky. That is the population that's living up at about 14,000 feet, so as cold and, you know, alpine-y as you can get. Trail Ridge is experiencing a little bit more of a decline. Anecdotally, we have seen, I mean, last year was like one of the highest population years we've had in a long time. So that's good, but overall the trend is in decline, and we think that's because of, obviously, when you have a warming climate, you are slowly shrinking your alpine and subalpine zones. So your montane plants are getting higher and higher up on the slope because it's warmer, oftentimes more moist, less snowpack, and yeah, that's causing our alpine plants, which is very sensitive, to be kind of, I don't know, like kicked out by, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but when we're thinking about vertebrates and animals that live in these areas, especially you have some birds that can just move more north, so change their latitude in order to stay in the thermal zone that they're comfortable with. But when we think about birds that are on mountaintops, they don't have anywhere else to go. You can't go any higher, right, because the mountain's not growing. So a lot of what I do is thinking about, are ptarmigan able to adapt to rapidly warming temperatures? What are some strategies that managers can use in order to, thinking about these birds as we inevitably get warmer? And interestingly, this is kind of a neutral outlook. We do see that ptarmigan are advancing their laying dates, so they are kind of keeping up as the snow melts and green up happens sooner. They are able to adjust their phenology, which I maybe will have time for a little bit to talk about later. So they are laying their eggs sooner, eggs are hatching sooner, and chicks are able to, we see some preliminary evidence of them able to take advantage of the longer growing season, even though it is more variable and warmer. Okay, so my research in particular, what's very cool about this project is that it's been going on since the 1960s. In y'all's top right was a man named, or he's still alive, his name is Clayton Braun. He is long since retired though. He started the project at Mount Blue Sky, formerly Mount Evans. So we have thousands upon thousands of records of these birds. And like I said, they have distinct numbers, so we're able to see who's where year after year. And then a lot of times we have like family data as well, so who is the offspring of who. Yeah, and then these birds, so you say, why ptarmigan? That's kind of random. So they're very easy, relatively, to capture. They're ground dwelling, so they're not like, you don't have to set up big mist nets like you do for passerines, and you can observe them quite easily. So we're very lucky that our field sites here, especially at Trail Ridge Road, they're like a quarter mile off the road. That makes it a little bit easier for researchers to get out there, especially in the crazy terrain. And then you can get, or what I work with is the genetic data. We just take a little bit of the clip from a toenail. It's very non-invasive. Like if you've ever accidentally gotten down to the quick on a dog or cat snail, it's exactly like that. And then, yeah, really high quality bird blood is really easy to work with because they have nucleated DNA, which is no other vertebrate has. So basically you can do some good stuff from bird blood. And then additionally, we pluck breast feathers as well, and that is cool because we don't have blood samples from the 60s. That would be crazy, foresight when you didn't even know you could get the kind of DNA that I'm working with now. But we do have historic samples of feathers that we can get DNA out of now and kind of get a snapshot of the past of what the birds were, their environmental conditions. And perhaps most importantly, ptarmigan are an alpine indicator species. As Celeste mentioned, they are an alpine obligate. They spend their entire life cycle above tree line. They're very unique. And there are a lot of birds that have a part of their life cycle up in the alpine, like they might breed in the alpine, but ptarmigan are truly unique that they spend their entire lives there. And they tell us how is the alpine as a whole ecosystem doing. So if the ptarmigan are in decline, that really suggests that the alpine is being degraded. So really good, kind of keep an eye on them. And that gives us an idea about the health of the ecosystem. So as I said, Trail Ridge Road and Mount Blue Sky, there's a little bit of a gap in coverage for Trail Ridge Road, but it's really been quite consistent in the banding project. We do spring and summer surveys, mark recapture, and then nest monitoring has been going on since 2013. Okay, so what does this look like? Step one, we have to find the birds, and it looks like this when we go out there. Roads are not plowed, it's a lot of snowshoeing and trekking poles, but we play male calls, so you play the, like on a game caller, the male like territorial call, and as I mentioned, they're so territorial that they hear that call and will come flying at the game caller box. And then we'll follow them back to their female when they realize that we're not a threat, or we're not a rival ptarmigan. So then, from there, we have to catch the birds, which you can see here is no easy task. This is usually a pretty, you better hope you get the bird in the net on the first try, or you're gonna be running after it for a few hours. Yeah, so trying with patience, but like I said, they are relatively easy to catch because they will only fly as like a last resort. So a lot of times we're still getting them on the ground. Okay, then processing birds. So all of our birds, we take measurements. I'll show you on the next slide in a minute. So they get feather measurements, carpal length, which is the full arm, carpal, which is the foot. We weigh them, we look at their wings, and we can tell if they are a subadult, so if they were a chick the previous year, or if they've been around a while. Grab some DNA, and then, yep, so you can tell on that far picture, so you ever see a ptarmigan wing? This rounded feather shape indicates that it's an adult, so if it was more pointy, we'd say, oh, those are chick feathers that they've hung on to since the year before, and they'll probably molt those at the end of this summer, and they'll have those beautiful rounded wing tips. So then they get their cool jewelry. We put ID bands, so they get a state band. This is for the state of Colorado, and then these are our project bands. So if you're ever up there, or you're on eBird, and you see a lot of the pictures of ptarmigan up there, we know those birds. So like Green 60 is a fellow that likes to hang out off of Medicine Bow Curve, and is quite famous because of that. So then, Nick is not here today, but he is the other PhD student in my cohort, and he does some really cool research on ptarmigan movement. So he has outfitted quite a few birds at this point with GPS backpacks that give updates every couple of days, so long as that solar panel stays uncovered. And then our hens get a radio telemetry collar. So has anybody heard of radio telemetry? Pretty common way of tracking wildlife. So they get this collar, it's not transmitting to anything. It's not like transmitting to a tower that we can track them. We have specialized equipment. This is called a Yagi. You put in that specific radio signal, you just listen to some beeps, and wherever the beep is loudest, that's where your bird is. So we put on collars on the females in the beginning of end of spring, early summer, and then we're able to track females while they're on their nest, when they have their chicks, and when they form back up in flocks. So pretty elegant way. And then a newer thing that this is again part of Nick's research, they are cellular tower collars. So as cell service has improved in the alpine, so has our ability to track ptarmigan. Those ping off cell towers, and we get, every couple of days, we get signal. So we've seen some pretty cool stuff, like the birds do travel quite far between peaks, seeing them fly over highways, like things we just didn't expect before, but yeah, they do make some pretty big movements.
So do those backpacks and collars fall off, or do you have to capture them again and get them
Yeah,
off?
they'll fall off. Yeah, so it's elastic. So the radio telemetry collars usually only last about a year or two, but yeah, it's like an elastic band. It degrades off of them, and there's a lot of really good data that it doesn't seem to impact or has really negligible effects on mortality. So, yep, they don't love them when they first get them, especially the backpacks, but they do seem to adapt really well, and we did a study on comparing birds with and without the backpacks and their movements and stuff, and they did great, and they look cute, in my opinion. Okay, so we're out there trying to get eyes on every bird about 3 times a week. And yeah, so as of now, we have genetic samples from about 1,100 birds. We've tracked 70, 80 hens on nests over the last 3 years alone. yeah, so just in terms of researching a cryptid species like this is really a wealth of data, and we're really privileged to have, the abundance of data that we do to work with. So what am I particularly interested in? I keep talking about genetics. What the heck do I want to know? So first and foremost, how has local adaptation changed over time? Like I talked about, we have some really cool historical samples of birds, comparing those to today. I'll get into all of these, hopefully, in a little bit. The prevalence and rates of extra-pair paternity, which I will describe what that means, rates of brood mixing, which is chick adoption, and lastly, whether habitat selection is heritable, and types of heritability. Okay, here's me in the lab, hard at work. Let's talk about their genetics and genomics. So, does anyone know what a molecular marker is? Has anyone done 23andMe? Okay, yeah, so that's a very general way of looking at what kind of data I am working with these birds. So, you have your double strands of DNA, and if you hopefully are familiar with at some point in a science class, having your base pairs of DNA, your C's, T's, G's, and A's. And for the vast majority of DNA, even when you're comparing like a human and a banana, it's gonna be really similar, right? Or exactly the same. Until you might have one of those base pairs differ between individuals. And that difference, sometimes it means nothing, and sometimes it is a change on the DNA that's impacting a difference in genes. So you can use these kind of, and that's a marker, a molecular marker. And there's different kinds of them, that's kind of an oversimplification of it. But essentially, I'm looking at a couple hundred of these differences of this one exact nucleotide that differs between individuals. And you can use that to determine how populations differ. So maybe my southern birds all have an A there, and then my birds way up in Alaska all have a G. And what does that mean? How did that mutation occur? What was it shaped by? A lot of times you can link that to an environmental trait, or not usually just one, usually it's a whole conglomeration of them. But this is just an aside. I like to throw this in there because I think it's cool. So typically, in the past, if you all are familiar with like the Human Genome Project, we only really recently sequenced the full human genome. It was very expensive and took a very long time, but fortunately, science has progressed very rapidly in this area, even in the last like 5 years. So usually what we have to do is just do our best with the closest relative for a genome that exists. So for example, when I was doing my master's research and studying sea lamprey, there was no close relative. No one had sequenced the genome. No one was like, I'm gonna shell out millions of dollars to sequence the genome of this gross fish. So I actually aligned the lamprey genome to the human genome because it was the best that we had. Like evolutionarily speaking, the human was as good as any other fish because this is a tangent, but the lamprey is so far diverged from everything else, the humans were good enough. So for ptarmigan, I know, it was weird. Okay, so for ptarmigan, we do actually have the turkey genome sequenced, which, great. Turkey are also part of Galliformes. It's not a songbird, so they're a lot more closely related to ptarmigan. But in the last 4 years now, USGS actually was able to sequence the white-tailed ptarmigan genome, which was really cool. And no one's used it yet, so it was sitting around waiting for a PhD student to come and take a look at it. So one of my questions is whether, was that a waste of money? So is it good enough to use the turkey or the human genome for a non-model organism, or is it really cool and I'm able to say these are the exact genes and gene pathways? So like, I'll give an example that Celeste actually thought was cool in my last talk, which I appreciate. So we do see differences. When I'm describing the changes in the nucleotide at those, that's called the single nucleotide polymorphism, by the way. But if we look at differences in like Alaska versus Colorado, the birds in Alaska, for example, have a longer gut length. So if you take out their intestines and measure it, it's longer in Alaska than it is in Colorado. And that's because if you remember back, well, probably because if you remember back in the beginning when I talked about how all three of the ptarmigan species live in Alaska, the ptarmigan that live in the north are competing with willow and rock ptarmigan, and they have a lot more restrictive diet, so they have a longer gut length in order to extract more nutrients from a less nutrient-dense diet, versus the southern ptarmigan, which have a little bit more of a expanded palate. So that's just an example of how birds can, or animals can differ. That's a really illustrative example. But anyway, we were able to figure that out using the turkey genome. I kind of want to know if we get any more specific or ptarmigan specific genes that pop out by using the ptarmigan genome. So a little bit of a simplification, but basically I'm saying, was that worth it to do all that work, or were we okay with the turkey? So I don't know, maybe that's not a super stellar thing if it turns out not to be true. But that's okay, it's all in the pursuit of science, right? Okay, so previously, this is where that gut length came from. My predecessors did a big range-wide divergence study looking at white-tailed ptarmigan across the range, and within the species, there are 5 subspecies. And ours down here is the largest concentration, like I said, that's Adaptations, and then we have the Rainier population, the Vancouver Island population, Lucura is just the biggest swath, which is pretty interesting. It's a really big area, but you still get really neat genetic structuring within that yellow. And then Peninsularis is mostly the Alaskan birds. So basically, whenever you see a color, the populations of birds within that chunk are all breeding with each other and they don't tend to cross into the other subspecies. And that's when we start to see those minute differences in physiology, behavior, that kind of thing. Okay, so what am I doing next? So from that study, they identified specific variables. So they said, why is yellow different from red? Which of those genes that are different correlate with environmental variables that are different across the range? So things like precipitation, perhaps things that you would intuitively guess. So temperature, snow cover, winter snow depth, that kind of thing. We really do see ptarmigan really clearly differ along those environmental gradients. So warmer down here, different precipitation regime, different vegetation, different birds, different genes under selection, because they want to thrive in that particular environment. So that is what is known as local adaptation. So fitness is survivability. How likely is an individual to pass on their genes to their offspring and continue the lineage? Whoa, okay. Please hold. Does anyone have any questions in the meantime? Doing good? Okay. SharePoint is not our friend today. Okay, well, if you remember that graph, yeah, okay. So if you have 2 populations, maybe Colorado, Alaska, these are our Colorado birds, or no, sorry, these are our Alaskan birds, and this one's our Colorado birds. We expect our birds in Colorado to have much higher fitness, better survivability, passing on more genes to offspring in their native environment than if we transplanted them. So if you think of those New Mexico birds that say, ooh, they're not doing great, well, New Mexico is a lot warmer, different montane structure, so birds that are adapted to Colorado might not necessarily be a good fit for even that relatively short of a distance. And yep, so these are some of the most important factors: elevation, snow cover, vegetation, and seasonality. So how long is that green up happening? How quickly do the seasons change? That kind of thing. Oh yeah, okay, well that's helpful. Okay, so we also have a really excellent collection of ptarmigan samples that were hunted in the late 1800s, early 1900s at the earliest. And I actually just got those at the lab today. So I am comparing about 70 samples from the early 1900s through 1950s, taking a subsection of birds from every couple of decades and comparing them to our contemporary samples, and able to see, not even, because we looked across the range, but just within Colorado, how over time, in the last 120 years, have these birds, do we see a shift in allele frequencies? So do we see a shift in number of certain genes in the population? Are they changing in a way we would expect with genes that are affiliated with like warmer temperatures or longer growing seasons? And that would give us an indication that, okay, they are able to adapt fast enough, we are seeing quick enough natural selection occurring, that we do see a good indication of them able to remain stable, even when it's really, climate is warming. So I don't have those results yet, because like I said, I just got them, but I'm really excited about it. I think it could be really cool, because like I said, they don't have anywhere to go off the top of the mountaintop. So yeah, like there's preliminary evidence to suggest they do adapt, but we're gonna see if, the frequency of that change. Okay, so kind of a big shift in gears here, but stay with me. So I'm also evaluating rates of like mating system types and of chick adoption. And I promise it will all come together and make a little bit more sense how these things fit together. So historically, biologists went out into the field and we just looked at, there's a male, there's a female, that's a pair, and looked at provisioning of care. So if you have a clutch of offspring, how are mom and dad taking care of it? Is it the same parents? And from this, we, the royal we, determined that about 90% of bird species are monogamous. So it's really unusual compared to some other taxa that they are so faithful to one another, that you have often birds, like a male and a female, that will be together not just one breeding season, but repeated breeding seasons. Yeah, so lots of papers, lots of species. That said, wait a second, this is not actually the case. It's kind of scandalous. So we'll get to that in a minute, now that I've piqued your interest. But let's talk about why birds might, not that it's like a choice, but speaking, why they might so-called choose to form a within-pair bond. So you know exactly what you're getting. You're not taking any risk with trying to find another bird to mate with outside of the mating pair. You know the quality of the offspring. So if they're compatible, have offspring that survive to the next breeding season, that is a safe choice. And extra pair mates can be really hard to find and maintain, hunting for a side piece, kind of difficult when you're trying to maintain what you have with your pair. And then birds get STIs too. And there's also a risk of retaliation from the social mate, and birds do get divorced. So if they are not happy with their pair, then they'll split up and try with someone else. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned this, but they are sexually dimorphic in the sense that this is our female, they retain more of that darker plumage because they're nesting, so when they're on the ground, they need to look a specific way, versus the males, which retain a little bit more of that, larger splotches, and then they have this really cool eyebrow. So females do have the eyebrow too, but it's more significant. Okay, cool aside there. Okay, so in terms of parental care, we see really high rates of monogamy in birds because birds actually tend to provision for their offspring a lot more than other taxa. So parental care, we see a really high or positive impact on clutch survival. So the more that a parent is provisioning for the chicks, the survivability of that brood tends to go up. And then that's even more so with male provisioning. So there's a incentive for dad to stick around because he knows his offspring will have a greater chance of survival if he's helping out. And then even when not actively provisioning, so like I mentioned, ptarmigan will, as soon as the female nests, the male's out of there, but that that might not actually be the case because males can often act as a sentinel for predators. And even if they're a little bit far away, hanging out with, their bird bros, they can still keep an eye on the sky and then, make alarm calls for the hen and her brood, and still keep, indirectly, that's indirect provisioning. And all of these behaviors are seen in harsh environments, like in the alpine, when you have like harsher conditions, harder for chicks to survive. Okay, but what about extra pair mating? What is the draw here? So, oftentimes, if a bird ends up with another bird and they are not genetically compatible, like I said, their offspring might have be less fit, or they're too closely related, like if they're siblings or cousins or whatever, and then there's a risk of inbreeding depression, that might be an incentive for a bird or another species to seek out another partner. So more diversity, less an inbreeding impact, and then that can potentially increase mating success or fecundity. So more mates, more babies, that kind of thing. So I will say, like I said, we have since figured out by using genetic techniques, by doing testing, like genetic testing, like a Maury-Povich situation on our birds, that we determined that of 90% of birds that are socially monogamous, the majority of those are partaking in extra-pair mating. So when you look at the clutches of socially monogamous birds, of those birds, they're not all going to have the same father, if that makes sense. So I said, is that what's going on with ptarmigan? So what do we think? What is our preconceived notion of this? So ptarmigan are quite long-lived, like I said, high annual survival as adults. They have quite low fecundity, so low success with having chicks that survive to the next year. So because they have repeated breeding opportunities in consecutive seasons, so they're more tolerant to nest failure or chicks that aren't as fit. Because in the ptarmigan mind, it's, well, I have next year. So I'm not as willing to take risks with my mate. I'm okay with this one that I have, because if it doesn't work out, there's always next year. Versus some birds that only have one breeding season, they're gonna hedge their bet on seeking extra pair mates to have the most diversity in their clutch as possible. So additionally, ptarmigan, we don't think that they have, or we've seen that they have pretty low rates of inbreeding, because males tend to stay in their natal territory, so where they're born. We see a lot of the same chicks from, for example, Trail Ridge, we'll find them year after year, versus the females tend to disperse to the next mountaintop or several over, which reduces inbreeding and neutralizes those extra pair mating benefits. And additionally, they do have some differences between sexes. Like I pointed out, they do look a little bit different, but they're not like a peacock situation where you have really strong sexual selection. And that suggests that there's really low sexual selective pressure. So males don't have, what that means is that one male isn't typically way more successful than other males at parenting offspring. There's a pretty spread out success among individuals in the territory, so that is just one indicator that extra pair mating is actually probably pretty rare in this population. And then finally, thinking about the alpine, like I mentioned at the beginning, there's very little cover, and this high visibility allows males to see rivals from like miles away. So they really partake in rigorous mate guarding, which really reduces the ability of either sex to seek out a mate, because the male is constantly guarding the female, and the female is constantly being guarded. And then finally, or two more things. So alpine systems are really highly seasonal. Everyone is breeding at the same time. That really limits the ability to seek an extra pair mate versus with species that that are breeding all throughout the year. That gives them a little more flexibility. And then, like I said, harsh conditions end up leading to high parental care, which is another thing that incentivizes within pair mating, because like I said, if a male knows all of the offspring are his, he's more likely to care for them, stick around. Okay, so I am in the process of assembling a ptarmigan pedigree from those 1,000 birds that we have, essentially using those molecular markers I talked about you can put it into a program that will tell you who is related to who by looking at about 16 to 20 of those markers, which is pretty cool. So just a quick example of what this looks like. If mom's genes are, I think mom's purple and dad is green, and we look at 20 of her genes at these specific markers and 20 of dad's at the same, we would expect obviously all of our chicks, well, in this instance, if they're all moms, she's gonna inherit one copy from dad, one copy from mom, one copy from dad. However, in a lot of instances that I've looked at, there is some evidence that there is some evidence that not all of the chicks in the brood have the same father. So let's briefly, before I get into that, what my preliminary results are, let's also talk about chick adoption, because when you're looking at a clutch of chicks or a brood, so anywhere from like 2 to 10 birds, how many of them not only have different fathers, but are they biologically related to the mother that we caught them with? Because we're catching all of the chicks in August. They're all still quite small, so they're with mom. And I was really interested in, because so have you all ever seen like a duck or a goose and how they have like 30 like goslings or ducklings with them? Because they are really inclusive to adoption. So those are Anseriformes, which is the next closest relative to Galliform. So what that means is that they are the waterfowl versus landfowl, have a common evolutionary ancestor, and we see that our landfowl are also really inclined to adopt chicks that are not biologically their own. So just a fun fact there. So why would they do this? Well, more chicks dilutes predation risk, particularly if mom adopts some extras and one gets eaten. There's less of a chance that it was her chick that got eaten. Adult survival also increases with shared brood care. So if one hen in the population is having a really hard time raising her chicks, she gives them to another hen. Overall survival of the population is healthier. Hens, this is what I'm really interested in knowing, is whether they may adopt a relative's offspring, which would give them an indirect, it's called inclusive fitness benefit. So if a mom adopts her sister's chicks, part of her genetic material is still being passed on, which I'm looking into, because like I mentioned, the females disperse and the males tend to stay, but we don't know if females disperse in family groups. So are females traveling together in family areas, and that's something else I'm interested in looking at, is the relatedness of birds that are in a given area if they are not, that is not their natal territory. But perhaps what I think is most likely is that it could be purely accidental. They don't have great kin recognition, so sometimes a hen will just see chicks and say, I have no idea how many chicks I have, so just might as well take some more. I mean, that's something that's impossible to know because we can't ask them, right? But it does seem that they have very poor kin recognition and don't necessarily know which chicks are theirs, so they might as well just take whatever, just because it could be theirs, potentially. Okay, so preliminary results there. So this is from a very small subsample of all of the broods that I still have to look at. I have a couple hundred, this was about 20. But about 65% of chicks were related to both parents. So that does actually point to social monogamy being the most common mechanism in these populations, which is notable. Like I said, that's actually quite rare in birds. 12% all chicks were related to the mother, but not the father. So in those 12% that we saw, there is some evidence of extra-pair mating. And then another 12%, some chicks were related to both parents. So some were adopted, some might have been related to both parents, some might have been related to just the mom, so it gets very complicated. And then finally, that last 12% sliver is that you have a hen who just adopted all of the chicks, which just anecdotally, sometimes you see one hen with like 30 chicks with her up in the alpine, and their clutch size only ever, gets as big as 8, so, those chicks came from somewhere, and they're all different sizes, and you're like, yeah, something's going on there. Okay, so I'll just wrap it up here. The implications of this idea is that harsh erratic conditions can reduce offspring survival. Like I mentioned, it's tough to survive in the alpine, so potentially increase in parental care incentivizes monogamy. So like I said, those dads are potentially, not actively feeding the chicks, but looking out for predators nearby. And why this is important in terms of like global climate change and conservation of the species is that as bird densities shift, breeding densities may shift, and that might be an indication of population health. So if we see, way more extra-pair mating is occurring, well, what are the things that contribute to that kind of mating behavior? What kind of pressures, breeding, synchrony, and all the other things that I talk about, those are just insights into population health. And then it all contributes to greater genetic diversity, which allows for that adaptive response that I talked about in the previous section, where in order to have that local adaptation, to be able to adapt to the environmental traits, you need a lot of standing genetic diversity in the population. So if you don't have the genes, if no one in the population has the genes to survive extreme heat, then that population is more likely to die out. But if if a couple of birds are able to pass that on to their offspring, then that can perpetuate and become the dominant trait in the population and confer survivability. Okay, so we don't actually have time to go through this, unfortunately, but essentially I'm interested in also looking at how those two things combine. So when we're thinking about where birds are, what time of year, is that a heritable trait? So let's see. Well, this is never is, that's okay. There we go. No, okay. Yeah, there we go. Okay, sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay, so essentially what I'm wondering is something like habitat selection, where birds decide to go and when, is that something that they're passing on to their offspring? So, yeah, like I said, it gets really complicated with dispersal mechanisms between the sexes, but hopefully able to tell over time if some family lines are better at selecting better habitat than others. Okay, so other things that I'm thinking about and don't have time to do in my rapidly diminishing PhD, but still thinking about, is brood mixing primarily among related hens? Do offspring eventually take over their parents' territories? And what is the overall reproductive success and fitness of this species? Oh, okay, so thank you for bearing with me. I have a lot of acknowledgements, a lot of people that make this project possible, organizations as well. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but you can write down my email and I'm happy to.
We can
Okay, we can take this questions. But you can also email me anytime if you think of something later. Yeah, I'm happy to chat.
I have an online question.
Yeah, of course.
Erin said when she saw ptarmigan, they were easy to approach and photograph.
Yes.
Have you found that they're not very skittish as well?
Oh,
and
yes.
If so, why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, so ptarmigan only more recently have large body mammals like coyotes and foxes made it up to the alpine. So traditionally ptarmigan's predators were overhead, so birds of prey. So when you approach them on a horizontal plane, not saying you should, but they are really tolerant to a lateral movement as opposed to, like I said, when you have the net coming over them, they'll have that predator response versus, yeah. So we do see that they're really approachable for that reason. Yeah, good question.
So two things, how long do the mothers feed the chicks? So when they're adopting, are they having to feed that many?
Yeah, good question. So I did not mention this. Ptarmigan are born fully ready to go. Like they're running around as soon as they're hatched. They're not like a lot of pasturine species that you see that mom is feeding the chicks. They feed themselves as soon as they're mom's job is more like corralling them, making sure no one strays off too far, guiding them towards, they very slowly make their way towards big flocks that time of year, but yeah.
And then we've been going up to Trail Ridge Road literally 40 years in a
Yeah.
row. And this year at the top of ABC,
Yeah.
there was one, and
Yeah.
she was on a nest, she must have been on a nest.
Oh, yeah, really recently? That makes
Well, like 3 weeks,
Yeah,
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, very cool.
So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
could
we
probably
could see her.
Maybe look it up and tell you what her number is, but yeah, that's awesome.
We were just floored. So.
Yeah, it's really cool to see. Yeah, go ahead.
So how common is female dispersal among species? Because usually I think of males as the ones that are dispersing.
I don't actually know the answer to that question. That is a good question. Yeah, the mechanism behind why females are the ones dispersing, but I think it's just like evolutionary stopgap measure for inbreeding, and yeah, that's a great question. I'll look into it.
Are you noticing changes with climate change? Changes in the
yeah.
birds?
Well, I've only been out there for 3 years, so I can't necessarily speak to it, but the snowpack, for example, even in the last 3 summers has gotten less and less. They're heat stressed more. So when we're out there catching them, we have to be really mindful, or they will overheat and they open their mouths and like start to pant. Yeah, so I mean, I haven't personally, because I haven't been out there long enough to see, but anecdotally, like my advisor and his mentor, yeah, have spoken to greater heat stress when interacting with them. Yes.
I think this was alluded to in an earlier question, but when you tag or put the little tags on these birds, and I've been asking it also about other species, does that not make them less like the others in their group and therefore don't come near me?
Yeah. No, actually, so you mean like socially speaking?
No.
Yeah, I don't think they're the brightest bird. So they got a little bird brain going on. So we don't see them like a pariah. Thank you for coming. Yeah, that's a good question. No, so and like I said, it has been studied just to make, like, biologists have done like due diligence when we're putting equipment on animals that we're not causing more harm than the research is contributing to good. So yeah, fortunately, not too smart, it's gonna be okay. Yes, and then online question? Yeah. Okay. You wanna do, or your first?
Let her go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I'm trying to think how to word this right. So we're looking at a study up in the Alpine right now that looks at climate change's effect on the blooming of the wildflowers and how climate change could be making them bloom a little out of sync with their pollinators. And so there's problems with pollinating the wildflowers, but it's also a problem for the pollinators for the food source. Is there anything, since they're up there in that same tundra alpine area, is there any mismatch between when they're hatching out, or does it really matter? I mean, they're good to go right from the start, so will it really matter if things get out of sync, do you think, or what?
Yeah, so there's been, so Greg Wan, if you ever want to read a really cool paper on like pretty much that exact subject, he looked into like phenological mismatch.
Right.
So whether chicks hatching too late or too early in terms of like flowering time impacted their survival. And I can't actually remember, I should know this because it was part of my candidacy exam, but yeah, sorry I don't have a satisfying answer for that.
Who was it again?
Greg Wan, W-A-N-N, yeah, definitely recommend his stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, because he specifically for his PhD research looked at phenology of the alpine versus ptarmigan like chick hatching. So,
Wow,
yeah,
okay.
good resource there.
When was that done, do you know? Just-
2016, 15?
Okay,
Yeah,
okay. Great, thanks.
yeah.
Do you see any evidence of the ptarmigans moving down to lower elevations?
Yes, actually, so last year was the first year that we found birds that were like in the trees. And that was so unusual, but just gets so hot that, yeah, and who knows with like predation risk and like changing things. If that's consistent, if it's just that pair, that was weird. But yeah, so that's also, you know, when it gets really hot, they do tend to move a little bit, but there's just so little room between tree line and mountaintop. But yeah.
Vicky asked, do they typically hang out together in groups?
Yeah, so that's a great question. They overwinter together in like big flocks, and they split up during the mating season and when females nest. When females nest, the males do tend to form like bachelor flocks, and birds that are not successful in mating will join those flocks as well. And then by the time the chicks get a little bit bigger and are a little bit less fragile, then the hens with the chicks will also join the greater flock. So usually by October, they're flocked up again.
Well, I was just gonna say,